The Institute.
Institute for Justice.
The National Law Firm for Liberty.
Hello and welcome to Short Circuit, your aspirationally bi-weekly podcast on the federal courts of appeal. I'm your host, John Ross, joined by Sheldon Gilbert of IJ's Center for Judicial Engagement, as well as IJ Senior Attorney Robert McNamara. This week on the show, funeral protests, abortion protests, and escheatment. What is escheatment? You'll have to wait till the third and final case. But first, Bob, start us off with Nebraska's law on funeral protests.
Nobody does a cliffhanger like you, John Ross. So, for funeral protests, we find ourselves in the Eighth Circuit, once again dealing with the lovable scamps in the Westboro Baptist Church, who I guess are doing the rest of us a service by being the worst people in the country, so we don't have to worry about being the worst people in the country. As most people probably know, they make a habit of going around protesting at military funerals on the theory that burying slain soldiers sort of valorizes American patriotism, and American patriotism should not be valorized because something about gay people. That's as much as I understand their theory, but they accomplish this with lurid signs outside of funerals, which has resulted in a lot of states passing laws attempting to curb this kind of behavior. And the law they're challenging here is a Nebraska law making it illegal to engage in picketing or a protest activity, I think is how the law phrases it, within 500 feet of a funeral for 1 hour before the funeral, leading into a period after the funeral. And it's challenged as a violation of their First Amendment rights. And the Eighth Circuit upholds it, I think, plausibly as a time, place, and manner restriction. This isn't a restriction based on the message of what people can say. This is simply a restriction trying to preserve the quiet character of a funeral. And kind of the interesting thing to me in the case only happens in a footnote, which is how you go about defining what this protest activity is in the first place. It's not defined in the statute, and it seems like you could get yourself into real constitutional trouble by regulating protest activity. That I cannot stand on the corner with a sign saying my boss doesn't pay me enough money, but I can stand on the corner with a sign urging people to eat more Cheetos. That seems like it's plausibly content-based, and the court just kind of glides over it in the sense that the only people who seem to be engaging in any kind of protest activity in the area are the Westboro Baptist Church, and presumably any other kind of protest activity would be swept up in the law as well. But I'm really not sure how one goes about defining protest activity. I think if you stipulate that protest activity is a content-neutral category of speech, you can probably say that this is a content-neutral law.
Now, the Westboro Baptist Church didn't really agree, I understood, that they were the only ones potentially swept up by this, right? There's another group present that they said, look, that sounds like protesting activity to us as well, or the type of activity that ought to be covered by the ordinance. Why didn't you stop this group that rides around to funerals to support the funerals? Why didn't you stop them as well?
Well, and that seems like kind of where the crux of the problem comes, because this group, the court says, isn't engaged in protest activity because they're not communicating anything. They don't have a target audience. They don't have a message. They don't have any communicative content. As I understand it, this is a group of people who rides around to military funerals and stands there. Reading between the lines, they stand in between the Westboro Baptist Church and the people trying to attend the funeral as just sort of a visual wall. But those people aren't engaged in protest activity because they're not engaged in any kind of communicative activity. So they're not subject to a time, place, and manner restriction on their speech. They seem like not necessarily the edge case. I think you can say standing there silently without communicating is clearly not protest activity. The Westboro Baptist Church clearly is protest activity. And I think where you can get into trouble is there seems to be a big gulf between those two ends of the spectrum. And the law doesn't define where we draw the line, and the court is, for understandable reasons, uninterested, I think, in interrogating where we should draw the line.
Well, hang on a sec, Bob. It sounds like you're saying that a silent vigil, for instance, couldn't be construed as protest activity. I mean, there's certainly scenarios where I think it could be.
No, I think that's a good point, and it kind of goes to what exactly we're trying to ban. The kind of the classic content-neutral way of restricting this activity without regulating speech is just to restrict standing on street corners. But we don't want to restrict standing on street corners. We don't want to have a 5-block no-go zone around any church anytime there's a funeral. And so the question really does come down to, and this may have to be sussed out in sort of as applied challenges to this law. The Westboro Baptist Church really brings a facial challenge here. They attempt to bring as-applied challenges based on prior enforcements of the law against them, though they seem not to have really been burdened by the law in the past because they got to protest where they wanted to protest anyway. But it seems like where things really come down are going to be as-applied challenges to how exactly the state is going to go about defining protest activity. Now, this is the Westboro Baptist Church kind of has its own little niche of First Amendment law because cities are going to extraordinary lengths and states are going to extraordinary lengths trying to restrict what all of us can kind of concede is morally reprehensible behavior. But it turns out to be behavior that is very difficult to regulate without accidentally sweeping up a bunch of speech you don't want to regulate or without creating real First Amendment problems for yourself.
Now, it's interesting that you kind of describe it as a Westboro Baptist niche area of law, and it's true. The church says that they've engaged in something like 55,000 protests over the course of the history of the church. They claim to. Right. I don't think it's decided whether or not that's an accurate number, but clearly it's more than just, one or two times. Right. Even if it's a niche practice or a niche area of the law right now, it seems that with recent tragic events in Charlottesville, Virginia, and elsewhere, I think on the top of mind of a lot of people is precisely how we are to deal with objectionable content, speakers who are saying things that a lot of people don't like and are extremely uncomfortable with in public spaces. And so this strikes me as a question that's not going to be limited to the Westboro Baptist Church. It's not going to be a question that's going to get easier to decide in the future, but it's something that a lot of people are thinking about. What are the proper limits, if any, on the rights of individuals who are sharing views that are marginalized to share those views, not just in public, but in defiance of those who don't like those views?
Though I think the Westboro Baptist Church presents sort of a slightly different issue in that what they're really doing is trying to disrupt particular events, which is not historically the method of protest of any group in the United States. People generally don't say, what we really want to do to get our message across is disrupt weddings. We don't care whose wedding. We don't care why they're getting married. We're just going to go to weddings and shout unrelated things about our political message. So it's really only in the context of the Westboro Baptist Church and of things like abortion protests, which we'll get to in our next case, where you start to see laws that are targeted not so much at the speech and the protest itself, but are targeted at trying to create bubbles around particular activities, sort of speech-free bubbles around particular activities that the state wants to protect.
Now, the Westboro Baptist Church would disagree that they're disrupting the funerals, right? I think that they say that their protest format is that they start before the funeral and they end once the funeral, begins, and that they always make sure not to restrict the ability to enter or leave the funeral, and they leave promptly as soon as the funeral starts.
And they also don't approach attendees.
Though I think that goes to an interesting subtext in the case is that apparently the state presented an expert witness who interviewed attendees at the funerals about their reaction to seeing these protests and how victimized they felt and how upsetting they found it, and sort of advanced this expert witness as an explanation for the state's interest. But that also seemed, and it's unaddressed by the court or apparently by the parties, that seems like a uniquely content-based expert witness. People attending these funerals feel victimized by the Westboro Baptist Church because the Westboro Baptist Church is saying vile things. I can't imagine that those people would feel equally victimized by the fact that a unionization protest happens to be going on across the street from the church. And yet the expert testimony presented about the state's justification here really is about the content of what the Westboro Baptist Church is saying or demonstrating on its signs to the people attending the funeral.
I don't think that I see what the Westboro Baptist Church is doing as particularly unique. It's true that they've kind of singled out funerals as their space where they're going to take a particular message and try and make people feel uncomfortable about at the event. But that is true of pretty much any protest, right? The whole purpose of a protest is to take your message to a group of people who disagree with you, who share alternative views, and to often make them feel uncomfortable. And that happens in lots of different contexts. And I don't think that's unique to the Westboro Baptist Church.
Usually in contexts that are related to the actual subject matter of the protest, though. I mean, the Westboro Baptist Church protests military funerals not because they're upset about the military, but because they're upset about homosexuality, which is that disconnect, I think, is what leads to some of the more unusual regulations we see in this area.
But is it a disconnect? Again, I guess subjectively to the Westboro Baptist Church, they don't see that there's a disconnect, right? They have an internally coherent to them explanation for why there's a connection. It's just less apparent to most people who just don't understand or agree with their particular theology. But from their perspective, it seems like they're targeting their message to an audience that they want, to understand.
If you take them at their word, yes. I mean, the thing with the Westboro Baptist Church, I always kind of single out the Westboro Baptist Church, frankly, as the opposite of everything we do at IJ in our First Amendment practice. Not to say that they shouldn't be entitled to the full protections of the First Amendment, but I think it can be easy in certain ways for free speech advocates to look at the most extreme speech, the most offensive speech, and kind of cloak themselves in the First Amendment and feel good about the fact that they say, we want to protect even this speech. But the thing with the Westboro Baptist Church is it's easy in a way to protect their speech because it's unpersuasive. No one looks at a Westboro Baptist Church protest and thinks, man, these guys have a point. I'm going to look more into their literature. It's purely for the shock value. I tend to think where the rubber really meets the road in the First Amendment is not fights about offensive speech or outrageous things people say, but about persuasive speech. It gets much more difficult, I think, for people to look at speech they disagree with, but that might actually persuade someone, whether that's political speech or whether that's, say, one-on-one advice that people are giving about things like diet or well-being. To look at those and say, I disagree with what you're saying, and someone might be persuaded by that, and someone might act on it, but I'm still willing to stand up for your right to say it. And so our focus tends to be more on persuasive speech in the real world, speech people want to actually listen to. And the Westboro Baptist Church is certainly entitled to the protection of the First Amendment, but it just is, it's the exact opposite of everything I work on when I work on free speech cases.
A week ago, I would have listened to that without batting an eye, but we just had the Charlottesville protests, and it seems like the rubber is really going to meet the road in terms of hateful speech needing protection and where to draw that line.
Bob raises a really interesting point about how the stakes are raised when the speech is persuasive, and I think that's where the recent protests in Charlottesville, I think the rubber hits the road. As John says, I don't find that white supremacist speech persuasive. And in fact, I am baffled and I can't wrap my brain around the concept that somebody could listen to kind of that vile content that they're spewing and be persuaded by it. But apparently I'm wrong. Apparently there are people who are finding this persuasive. Apparently there are people who think that when they hear the things that these folks say, want to sign up to go to protests like that. And so that raises the stakes of these debates. The debate over to what extent we're going to provide, a free space for people to say absolutely horrific things. I mean, that's an important question we're debating right now, but it's not a new question. Eugene Volokh, a First Amendment scholar, has a post recently on his blog, Volokh Conspiracy, hosted by the Washington Post, that kind of lines up all of the arguments for limiting and curtailing and censoring pro-communist speech in the 1950s and the same arguments that are coming out right now to censor or prohibit white supremacist speech in 2017. And he makes a really persuasive argument that the types of arguments that are being levied are pretty much exactly the same. And I think, many people looking back with the benefit of and the safety of decades of distance between us and efforts to censor pro-communist speech in the 1950s, we can say, oh, well, gosh, that was terrible. Free speech ought to have prevailed. And, those poor unenlightened rubes who wanted to censor communist speech back then, how could they? But those are the same types of questions that are being raised right now with respect to white supremacist speech. Again, I don't find that speech persuasive. I'm baffled by those who do, but somebody is finding it persuasive. And the fact that they're finding it persuasive means that the stakes are raised and there are serious consequences that we have to think about in terms of, the practical reality of lived life.
Okay, let's move on to the next case, which comes from Maine. Sheldon.
This is another protest case. This case also involves a restriction about the type of speech that can be engaged in within 500 feet of a particular location. In this case, the Maine statute at issue, which was substantially amended in 1995, says that it is unlawful to summarize what the district court said, to interfere or attempt to interfere with a person's civil rights. And the statute covers 4 circumstances in which it's unlawful to interfere with a person's civil rights. First, it's unlawful to physically obstruct the entrance or exit of a building. So if civil rights are being exercised, in this case, if we're talking about a clinic that provides abortion services. Second, making repeated telephone calls to disrupt the activities of the building. So again, we're talking about making it harder for the person inside the building to do whatever it is they want to do inside the building. Third, setting off any device that releases nauseous and offensive odors within a building. So, smoke bombs or stink bombs or stuff like that. And fourth, and this is the one that's of relevance here, making noises in a certain way and for certain reasons. And that's the piece that's at issue here. You have a protester, a pro-life protester who's making noises, very loud noises outside of an abortion clinic. And the abortion clinic says, hold on, this is making it harder for us to actually do the thing that we want to do inside this building, right? It affects the safety of the individuals inside the building. If we can't, if a nurse can't hear what a doctor is saying, if a patient can't hear what a doctor's saying, that makes it harder to exercise.
Well, the patients are just intimidated by the noise.
Or patients are intimidated by the noise. That makes it harder to exercise the civil rights within the building. And so the question is whether or not this restriction on these noises that can interfere with what's going on inside the building is constitutional. Now, the challenger says, well, hold on, you don't even tell me like how loud I can be, right? If you could give me a hard decibel figure of how loud I can be, then I can comply with the ordinance. But I don't know that. I don't know how loud I can be, number one, so it's kind of vague. And number two, I think that this statute is designed to prevent people like me from protesting abortion clinics. And for that reason, I think it's a content-based restriction. Now, the opinion by the First Circuit, it was written by Judge David Barron. He's the son of famed First Amendment scholar Jerry Barron at George Washington University Law School, who's famous for his right to access work. And I have to imagine that Judge David Barron and his dad had amazing First Amendment dinner conversations. But in this opinion by Judge David Barron, he kind of walks through and highlights the legislative history of this particular ordinance. This ordinance was passed with the pro-life and pro-choice groups got together and kind of hammered out the language that they thought would protect groups across the board.
So in the 80s, you get a bunch of pro-life groups that are actually in favor of this language, right?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly seems to be the case from reading the opinion, that this was designed as a way to defuse potential violent conflicts around these clinics. And I have to say, I'm not sure I'm persuaded by the argument that the law should have a specific decibel level. It seems like we've always had kind of general harassment laws that it's illegal to, with the intent to harass, call someone too many times in a row. And those laws don't say you can make 4 phone calls consecutively, but you can't make 5. That, at a certain point, disruptive conduct with the intent to disrupt can be prohibited. And I think the opinion makes a good point, which is that not all noise is speech. That, if someone wants to stand outside an abortion clinic and shout abortion is bad really loudly, that's obviously protected speech. But if someone wants to stand outside with just an air horn That's not necessarily communicating a message, and the test for whether either of those is banned is whether it's loud enough to be heard inside and whether the person making the noise has the intent to disrupt what's going on inside. You could violate the law by playing this podcast really, really loud. And that is not necessarily a content-based distinction. That's just a restriction on how much noise you can make with a particular kind of ill intent.
Friends, we're going to pause here for a brief intermission. Just take a moment to collect your thoughts. And in the meantime, please visit ij.org/short-circuit to sign up for our weekly email newsletter, which is a roundup of 15 or 20 cases from the federal circuit courts each week. Now back to the show. Now, the plaintiff says this law really only in practice applies to abortion protesters, and the court draws this analogy that, maybe it could also potentially apply to union protesters outside of a hospital if they got loud enough. Does that argument get any purchase with you, Sheldon?
I think it does. I'm more inclined to agree with Bob on this one that first, I don't think that there needs to be a specific decibel limit. And second, I think this does to me look like a time, place, and manner restriction. Now, one thing that I do find a little bit unpersuasive about the opinion is the section on the legislative history, just what it is that they were trying to accomplish there. This is a 50-page opinion. And early on in the opinion, the court says, well, if we really want to understand this question, whether or not this statute was designed to be, content-based restriction on anti-abortion protesters, then we ought to look at, the process by which the legislature enacted the statute, right? And it sounds like there's going to be an important discussion of that question. But we don't even get that question asked or answered in any meaningful way until the last page of the opinion in basically a paragraph, right? So what is presented is a really important question. Why did the legislature do this? Was the legislature intending to block anti-abortion protesters? We get a very short, kind of almost glib recitation of the legislative history that says what I just described, the court saying that, pro-choice and pro-life groups both together agreed that this was the right approach. And I just don't know, right? I don't have enough in the opinion to know what the real legislative history is. And even if that's
true, that seems like it emphatically shouldn't be the test. If Democrats and Republicans get together and agree on a law that's going to limit the amount of political speech in a particular park, that doesn't control whether a dissident Democrat or Republican who thinks his side sold him out has a valid First Amendment claim. If what the law is really trying to do is limit speech. If both sides got together and said, you know what, this speech is bad, and so we should reduce the amount of speech with this content, I don't think it matters that it's bipartisan or that it's an agreement of two different sides of the issue, if that's actually what's going on here, which on the face of the law doesn't seem to be the case.
When you say that, it immediately jumps to mind the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, BICRA, right, where Republicans and Democrats got together to establish limitations on speech, which a lot of folks argue was basically two groups of incumbents coming together and agreeing to limit speech to protect incumbents, right, to protect the incumbents from speech by outsiders who want to break into the political system. And it certainly can't be that because there was bipartisan unanimity that the speech is going to be that the speech restrictions are going to be protected. That said, I think what the court is trying to say is that it's important to ask what it is the legislature was actually trying to do, right? And was the legislature actually trying to impose a content-based restriction? And I think that's the type of question that it is legitimate for a court to ask when it's looking at, important First Amendment questions is, what is the actual intent of the legislature?
No, that's absolutely true. And I think it's, at least in the free speech context, courts are frequently willing to engage in that kind of salutary analysis of what's actually going on, and is this law a fig leaf for something slightly more noxious? And not having read the briefs, just looking at the opinion, it doesn't seem like there's good evidence that this is an attempt to restrict particular content of speech. It's an attempt to restrict the amount of disruptive noise, presumably on the grounds that if someone's making disruptive noise, other people try to stop them, and that leads to physical clashes and to other things that everybody on every side of the issue would prefer to avoid.
This opinion, to me, was kind of like watching a really good movie trailer and then going and watching the movie and being really disappointed, right? The first few paragraphs of the opinion, the introduction of the opinion that kind of lay out the tests and the issues and how we're going to decide the case is, to me, like a really good trailer that suggests we're going to get something really meaty and good. And instead, we get 50 pages of, not terrible, but not particularly persuasive, not particularly in-depth analysis. And I kind of felt like a promise was broken between the introduction of the opinion and what we actually got.
Okay, gentlemen, I don't know if you're ready, but I hope you are. It's time for the debut of escheatment on the Short Circuit podcast.
This is a momentous day. All of you out there who have been emailing John Ross incessantly, begging him to address the law of escheatment on the podcast, today is your day. All one of you. Speaking of harassing communications.
Let's, to be clear, there are a lot more than one people who generally harass John Ross. Just only one person harassing John Ross about escheatment.
Yes, one person harassing John Ross on the topic of escheatment, a topic near and dear to all of our hearts. Escheatment brings us to the Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit in a challenge to the state of Delaware's escheatment processes. Escheatment, for those of you who have forgotten your first-year property law class or perhaps have not yet attended a first-year property law class, escheatment is the process by which abandoned property is converted to the ownership of the state. If someone dies without a will and without any heirs, their property escheats to the state. And Delaware is a very active escheator of property. There's actually a state officer in Delaware who is the Delaware State Escheator. His job is to value and collect all of the abandoned property in the state. As an interesting side note, escheator is actually where we get the word cheater. And there was a feudal officer, just as Delaware has, called an escheator, whose job it was to value and collect all of this property. These officers were widely perceived as corrupt, and so the word escheator is where we get the term cheat in modern parlance. Or at least so Brian Garner tells me, and Brian Garner is always right about everything. So the widespread perception of corruption and overreaching continues from feudal times to today, leading to our Third Circuit lawsuit against several Delaware officers, including their state escheator, challenging Delaware's process for determining whether property is abandoned and how much abandoned property there is. Because apparently Delaware's process requires periodic audits conducted by a third-party auditor to determine how much abandoned property exists, how much abandoned property is owed to the state, a process that allegedly can take months or years at the cost of up to $1 million in compliance costs just to turn over documents and go through the audit process. And the audit process is conducted by a third-party private individual who, again, allegedly has a major financial stake in how much property the state of Delaware gets to collect.
It's on a contingent fee basis, right?
Yes.
Kelmar, which is the auditor, gets 10% of whatever it collects. So there was a big debate just a few years ago about among the state legislature whether or not Kelmar was getting too big of a cut, right? Because Kelmar has collected in contingent fees well over $100 million just in a few-year period.
I mean, escheatment, it's a fun word to say, and it's funny to joke about, but it's actually the third largest source of revenue for the state of Delaware. So we're not talking about a few properties here and there. We're talking about a huge flow of funds into Delaware state coffers, a significant slice of which comes off and goes directly into the pockets of people who determine how much money the state of Delaware is owed.
And Delaware is uniquely positioned among the states to take advantage of escheatment or abuse escheatment precisely because so many businesses are registered or incorporated in Delaware. In fact, about 1 million businesses are estimated to be incorporated in Delaware. And Delaware, the state of Delaware, has taken the position that if a company is incorporated in Delaware, then it can escheat any unclaimed property, no matter where in the country that property is. And this has led to all sorts of legal battles over the long reach of Delaware's escheatment power. In fact, 21 states last year brought an original action in the United States Supreme Court against Delaware saying, hey, Delaware, you're taking too much of this money, and this is our money. Attorney General Ken Paxton, stood on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court building and raised his fist and said, Delaware, you're taking our money, right? And, I would disagree. I think Delaware's taking other people's money. The money doesn't belong to the states either, right? But it's a huge, huge issue, and it dominates Delaware politics.
So, can we back up and talk about what this money actually is? So is this only folks who have passed away without a will, or,
No. That's kind of the classic. I think most people encounter escheatment for the first time or really ever in their practical lives in terms of people who die without an heir. That actually, in the way states have structured their modern wills and estates law, that almost never happens. It's very difficult for someone in modern America to die and actually have no heir as a matter of law. Really what we're talking about is abandoned property. Whether it is money held by a corporation that nominally doesn't belong to the corporation, that's held in trust or held in a third-party account on behalf of someone who has disappeared, has not shown up to claim it. We're talking about cash. Sometimes we're talking about real property, but a lot of this is ones and zeros in computer spreadsheets more than a plot of land or an old family farm where the family farmer has died.
Right. So to give you kind of a concrete list of items that Delaware considers abandoned property and goes after, we're talking about unclaimed stocks and bonds, insurance policies, right? So someone has passed away and no one has collected on the insurance policy, uncashed checks, and that includes money orders, and that's actually the basis for the multi-state original action against Delaware arises out of uncashed moneygrams. Uncashed checks, unclaimed wages. So suppose a company sends a check to an employee after the employee has been terminated or is no longer with the company and the employee never cashes the check. Dividends, which is really important for Delaware given the number of corporations incorporated there, unredeemed rebates, and one area that I've been involved in litigation, gift cards or gift certificates, right? Where you get a gift card from grandma, you use 49 of the $50, and then kind of forget about it because what are you going to do with that $1? What happens with that $1?
Right. And the question is, does the company get to keep that dollar? Do you get to keep that dollar? Does that dollar flow into the state's coffers? But anyone you see ads on the internet about unclaimed property and how you can find out if you have unclaimed property in any state where you've ever lived, that's all talking about this kind of abandoned property that if no one claims it will eventually escheat to the state or will escheat to the state of Delaware, apparently, no matter where it's located.
Right. One of the interesting aspects to all of this is you do have a pretty significant divide among the states about how they treat escheated property. You have a state like Delaware that sees it as a revenue source, right? That when they're budgeting, this is going to be the third largest source of revenue. And if they don't collect that money, then, that means schools get shut down, that kind of thing. They budget with the expectation that they're going to get to collect that money and use it for themselves. In contrast, you have a state like Utah that has a website, mycash.utah.gov, right? And they put all unclaimed property in a trust and refuse to use any of that money ever in perpetuity for the state's budget and instead keep it in a trust until people can come and claim it. And it just stays in that trust possibly forever, right? So there's a pretty big difference in the way that the states treat it. But during the last economic recession, the Great Recession or whatever you want to call it, when a lot of states were facing budget shortfalls and trying to figure out where they're going to find money, there was this mad dash across the entire country by a lot of states to go collect unclaimed property to fill those budget shortfalls. And I think this is where you get a really important property rights question, right? The original idea behind escheatment, and this is, Brian Garner talks about this. The idea behind a lot of these unclaimed property laws is to reunite the property holder with their property, right? And the state is just supposed to be this agent of the people to hold it in trust, to keep it for them until they can figure out who it belongs to. Now, there are certain circumstances where you're never going to find it, and in those limited circumstances, then it goes to the public use. That's the basic theory of this, but it's no longer that. Now states see it as a source of revenue to use on other things, and it's a great source of revenue because you don't have to go through the legislature and through the tax process.
We've dropped Brian Garner's name a couple times now. Who's Brian Garner?
Brian Garner is the editor of Black's Law Dictionary. He's the co-author of a number of books with the late Justice Scalia about the law and oral advocacy. He is I think it's fair to say to call him the leading light of modern legal writing and legal usage. I think most people who care about legal writing have read an awful lot of Brian Garner.
Yeah, and he's going to be annoyed with this because we keep calling these state laws escheatment laws, but he says they're actually abandoned property or unclaimed property laws, and that we should reserve the word escheat to refer to kind of the ancient feudal property right.
Which is how most states refer to it. Delaware is a little unusual in that it actually has an escheator, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited about this Third Circuit case, because I actually get to say escheator and be correct, and it's just enormously fun to say. It sounds like you're on the cusp of a swear word when you say escheator.
There's a simple mnemonic device to understand what escheatment is, right? And it's a con man cheats you out of your property, but the state escheats you out of your property. Now, Bob's going to complain about that, my little mnemonic device. But I think it's
an etymologically correct mnemonic device. Cheat and escheat are, the root of the word cheat is escheat.
But the state doesn't escheat.
That's the only fact I know. I'm going to say it like 5 times.
Yeah. But, the state doesn't escheat your property. Your property escheats to the state, and that's kind of the proper way to say it, but that doesn't work as nicely with my
Well, that is enormously fun, and to double down on the enormous fun, let's talk about the actual case now.
No, I refuse. A lot of this is wrapped up, so many of the plaintiffs' claims are rejected by the Third Circuit as not ripe. I think on honestly fairly dubious grounds. The position of the Third Circuit is basically, look, your audit hasn't happened yet. The auditor hasn't decided you owe any money to the state. The auditor hasn't decided that you've been insufficiently cooperative, which apparently under Delaware law, if you are insufficiently cooperative in your audit, that ratchets up or down the amount of money you owe the state. So it's not just the collection of property. There's a penal aspect.
Yeah, well, not only that, but like you have this, in this case, the auditor sent a threat along with the original audit request saying, like, here's what you have to give us, and if we don't have this all resolved by date X, then instead of going back 30 years, we're going to go back 35 years, right? It includes a blatant threat in the audit request.
All of which seems enormously troubling, and all of which is brushed aside by the Third Circuit, essentially saying, we'll deal with this when the audit is concluded, after you've complied, I guess, with all of these burdensome requests imposed on you by the auditor. The only claim that survives is in many ways the claim that I find most personally interesting, the claim that goes right to the heart of these incentive problems that Sheldon was talking about, which is the claim that you have a procedural due process right to not have a financially interested adjudicator. We don't let prosecutors prosecute crimes on a contingent fee basis, and to the extent the state of Delaware is going after purportedly abandoned property on a contingent fee basis using a self-interested auditor who is empowered to make final decisions on how much any particular company owes the state, that's a massive procedural due process problem. We're supposed to have neutral adjudicators deciding these things, and the only person empowered to make any decisions in this case is a person who works for an entity that has a direct financial interest in maximizing the amount that you as the property owner have to turn over to the state.
Well, and we're not really, the opinion itself doesn't really talk about some of the juicy details about how this arrangement actually works. But back in 2014, Delaware officials were kind of scratching their heads because their unclaimed property revenue dropped, right? And they're trying to figure out, okay, we expected this amount of money, but we actually didn't get this amount of money. What happened? And what they figured out happened is the state escheator official had left the state to go join the private company because that's where the money is, right? And so you had this drop in the amount of money that was being collected as you had this transition period where the state official was then going to go to the private sector to do what the state is supposed to be doing, right? But has outsourced to this private entity. And, the stakes are high. We're kind of talking about auditing as, something that when you're picturing it in your mind, you're thinking, like, how big of a deal is it to have, some company come in and look at your records? Well, two things. Number one, the audits are going back to 30 years of all of your property records, right? And companies just don't keep records that long. So the auditor says, well, if you didn't bother to keep records for 30 years going back into the 1980s, then we'll just guess what you probably owe the state in unclaimed property. We'll do an estimation, right? So that's one piece of this to remember about how these audits actually work. The other piece to remember about how these audits actually work is that the cost of doing an audit, as Bob said, is significant. So for example, a couple of years ago, Travel Zoo was audited by Kelmar in the state of Delaware, and the cost of the audit alone wiped out an entire quarter of revenue for that company. These are not trivial amounts of money to just conduct the audit, and that's separate from the amount of money that then you have to pony up to the state to kind of settle your claim. Before this case, there was another very high-profile lawsuit, a constitutional challenge to the Delaware escheatment regime. That resulted in a really interesting opinion last year by a district court judge named Gregory Sleet. And in that case, Judge Sleet had some really harsh things to say about the practice that Delaware had engaged in, and it had said, I apologize, I'm looking for the quote.
I'd just like to point out while you hunt that we've talked about the Westboro Baptist Church, we've talked about abortion protest, and you and I are just transparently way more excited about escheatment.
Yeah. Which is, I don't understand why anybody would be less excited than we are about
this. This is why we're not cool, Sheldon.
Again, I think that there's a fascinating opinion that happened last year that was pretty harsh on Delaware and its processes, and I can't find the quote right now. But this is a really big part of Delaware's the Delaware state government's business model, but it's highly controversial within the state of Delaware. The Delaware State Chamber of Commerce has gone after the Delaware legislature, saying this is really hurting business in our state, right? You are creating a huge disincentive for companies to continue to incorporate in Delaware, because they know that if they have, a company that does most of their business in Texas, but they incorporate in Delaware, then all of a sudden they're going to be subject to these absolutely insane audits, and you're actually driving businesses away from incorporating in Delaware.
And so I think this also illustrates just a broader problem in modern American governance, where there is a hunger for getting revenue by picking particular citizens, turning them upside down, shaking them until money falls out of their pockets, instead of just raising broad-based tax revenue. It's a problem we've seen at IJ in the civil forfeiture context constantly, actually raising exactly this same procedural due process problem, where you have district attorneys' offices that fund themselves through the revenue from forfeiture proceeds in a way that, again, violates your right to have this kind of neutral adjudicator. So I think the same claim that the Third Circuit resurrects and sends back to the district court here about your procedural due process right to not have a financially incentivized adjudicator, we're currently litigating in Philadelphia about that city's forfeiture practices, in New Mexico about Albuquerque's forfeiture practices, and I think it's a problem we see again and again, where governments are just sending either private or public officials out with sort of a mandate to act like pirates, to go get us money that we can then use for our own purposes, and that causes real problems for the people who get caught up in that system.
Right, and in that June 2016 decision by District Court Judge Gregory Sleet, I like the way he described it. He described Delaware's escheatment program as, quote, a game of gotcha that shocks the conscience. And this, we're talking about it in the escheatment context, but you can add the forfeiture context, and I would add another area, fines and fees, right? This is the process by which many cities, particularly small cities, have figured out how to boost their revenues by really ramping up the number of types of fines that they will that they'll include, and the types of fees that they'll charge you, because they don't have to go through the legislature. They don't have to raise taxes. They just, go after you and issue a fine or a fee. And sometimes it makes up, half of a city's entire budget is these fines and fees.
Yeah, and if you're funding the courts through fines that are assessed by the courts, that starts to cause, I think, sincere doubt in the people before the court about whether the court's making a neutral determination or whether the court is making sure that next year's budget is going to be full.
Okay, that concludes the show. Thanks for listening. We appreciate you. And so until next time, this is John Ross from the Institute for Justice, palavering with you to get engaged.